You know how when you read, you want to make sure the words are right. I'm like, is this bourgeois, and then I read it was bourgeoisie, but I never
Sometimes.
heard it. I never heard of that before.
Yeah. So
Sometimes it's
so
the
what I was saying was,
bourgeois.
well, the bourgeoisie is the class of people. A bourgeois is one particular person within the class.
And fun fact of the day, the term bougie comes from the bourgeoisie.
That's what we're
That's what I
saying off
just said.
air. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Ah,
Bougie.
that was my fun fact.
When the
Yeah.
Migos say my B is bad and bougie, that's what they're saying. Part of the
Mm-hmm.
bourgeoisie.
Well, I
Mm-hmm.
knew that, like I said, I knew bourgeois meant like rich and glamorous. I guess that's what it's kind of turned into. But I didn't know that word was originated here. Kind of,
Yeah, I didn't realize it was a real thing either.
yeah. I thought
But
it.
what's interesting to me is though, like when he's saying it, like I don't know, like in France, it was like the middle class, like the middle to upper class, and then
Yeah.
but like the way he
Yeah.
writes about it, it's just like,
Well, let's get into
hey,
that.
Yeah,
turn the light on.
I'm sure we'll get it.
Let's get into that.
All right.
Let me say hello to everyone listening. This is the Magic in the Attic podcast, and this is the episode we've been building up for weeks now. Our special mini episode, the first edition of the new format, where every third episode we're going to discuss one specific topic. So we're really excited about the new format, and we hope we're able to learn some stuff, and hopefully you're able to join us in doing so. So before we go any further, you're probably familiar with the cast here, but might have heard or seen someone who you don't know. So my name's Piano Man. You know Midnight Mark. You know JBM. But with us, we got Robb Double B joining us
What's up,
here.
guys?
You got anything you want to say?
Yeah. I am Robb Double B, and I killed Preacher Paul. You're welcome.
Hunted him down.
I do not
Hopefully the-
regret this decision.
Sometimes
Hopefully
you
the feds
gotta
aren't listening.
commit homicide.
All
They're
right,
not
so
big enough yet. They'll comb
That's
over in 10 years. They'll comb our episodes over, and that's how they'll find out how he died.
That's how
but
they'll
it'll
know.
be beyond the statute of limitations.
Yeah.
So,
I do hope Paul's family's doing okay though.
oh yeah,
Still hasn't
our
been that long.
condolences.
Rest in
Our
peace.
condolences.
R.I.P.
All right, so as you know, we're talking today about the Communist Manifesto. So here we go. The book was published in 1848 and written by a German non-practicing Jew and a doctor of philosophy named Karl Marx. And while you do see Friedrich Engels' name alongside Marx's, Engels states that most of the ideas, and especially all the original ones in the book, come from Marx. So to put this in historical perspective, the Communist Manifesto here, this is about 50 years after the French Revolution, and it was near the end of the transition out of the Industrial Revolution. Both of these seem to have a major impact on Marx and the communist. So we're going to go here into chapter by chapter discussion. So I'm going to do a brief overview here of chapter 1. So chapter 1 is the outline of the major class struggle between that of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, as we were talking about before, are the class of people that control the means of production and use this system to continue to gain more capital and to get richer. The proletariat is a class of the laborer, or what we call the working class. So these are the people who actually produce everything to gain a wage or salary. So Marx argues that all people are split into one of these two classes, and that as people continue to join these two different classes, especially the proletariat class, they begin to distrust law, morality, and religion, and they see these as forms of manipulation by the ruling bourgeois class, and ultimately overthrowing that class to form a communistic system. So that was a brief overview there. What are you guys' thoughts on this first chapter? And I guess before we go too far, this is our first try at this. So if there's some different kind of format, or we're going to go into different topics, but If there's something you like about this format or don't like, just let us know. Email magicintheatticpodcast@gmail.com, as you always do. All right, take it away.
My first takeaway is that, especially, he does it the whole time, but especially in chapter 1, he says in one word, and then he has like an entire sentence after that, and I don't understand. It made me laugh every time because I was like, what is the word?
Yeah,
Like,
Do you think that's a translation thing though?
it
I don't know.
might
I mean, I don't
be.
know.
I don't know, because at one point there is one point, like the third chapter, where he says like in one sentence or something, but the rest of the time he keeps saying in one word, and it is not one word ever. Ever.
So, one of the things that stood out to me in reading this, and it was very interesting. It was different than I thought it would be because there's so much angst to it, right? I thought it was going to be more of a outline, where even in chapter 1, it almost seems like more of a complaint. It's sort of like his musings and his thoughts rather than a. Now it does turn into that a little bit later, and then if you read past the first 4 chapters, there's where uh, they talk about pledging allegiance essentially to the Communist Party, and it has that in it. But I found it really interesting how it is more of the way this person thinks, and that was an interesting way to look at it, rather than you know we have like the Constitution or we have textbooks on capitalism and that kind of thing, where it's very outlined out. This person, it's like communism to Karl Marx is a living and breathing thing rather than just a set of rules, which I thought was interesting.
yeah, I was totally on the same page with you. Like, I felt like I was reading just a struggle in general, like something you could read. I mean, obviously it's written differently, but
change
this,
change bourgeoisie and proletariat to like government uh and citizen, right?
yeah. Or like I was almost thinking, because they were saying like these people are kind of like this secret society that take over everything. When I first started reading it, I was like, is he describing the Illuminati or something here? Like, that's what came to my mind. I was like, what in the world is he describing? And then finally he's like, oh, these are just the people who control the means of capital production. And I was like, oh, that's all he means. But at first it was like this overarching like society of people that just control everything and everything that's going on, and nobody can break into it, and you're either on that side or you're not on that side, and you're just like a slave to the machine. And I was like, oh well, this is like describing what's happening now. But then
Facebook,
he like,
Twitter.
yeah, no, it was really funny when I read that. I was like, wow, I can kind of relate to this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like chapter 1, like all of the things that he describes, like that are like I agreed, like these are like issues that we face still as a society. The disagreements come in his solutions later, at least for me. But like the things that he talks about, like um, he talks about basically, the state is a tool of the ruling class, and I think that is certainly still relevant and true now. Um, but like he talks about a lot of different things. He says, it compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become the bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image, which again is not one word, but um, but
But it was written in German, so in
That could
Germany
have
they
been
really
one word.
do they
that
they
might
like
be a word.
push a
That's
bunch of
true.
words together. So
That's
to be
true. That's
fair, it
true.
could be written that way.
That's
It's
true.
just I just find it so interesting that so uh, it says the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to rule of towns. It's created enormous cities and has greatly increased the urban population as compared to rural. And he goes into talking about how these are negatives, right? And what I thought was so interesting is when you talk about the current state of mind, current socialism, right? I feel like they almost prop up chapter 1 and they sort of forget chapter 3, 2, 3, 4. And I know we'll get into that in a minute, but it's like JBM just said, there's a lot in chapter 1 that I'm like, okay, I get why this person feels this way. And I feel like chapter 1, Communist Manifesto, is what socialists and communists these days feel like communism is. And then they sort of ignore the other 75% of the book. But I just find it interesting how he goes, I'm almost reading this like he's saying all these terrible things. And I'm like, what do you mean? Capitalists built these huge cities. Cool.
Yeah.
Rob,
Yeah.
let us know.
I mean, like right on those lines. Right after he says, "You built these enormous cities with this upper class," then he says some good things about it. You know, he says it has rescued a considerable amount of the population from the idiocies of rural life. Okay, great,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, when he when he talked about the 10 hours bill in there, he said that this organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. Like they got power, and then they started dictating things. Like, duh, like that.
Yeah.
That's what
It's almost
happens.
it's almost like he's even admitting that capitalism is good for the beginning of a society, but then
That is his argument.
so that like after the establishment of the society,
Yep.
then you move into the more socialist. But here's the interesting
Well,
and I didn't
one
realize this
point there
too.
before you go too far is that is his point, is that capitalism naturally creates this divide between two classes. So you can continue. He's saying ultimately those two classes end with the proletariats defeating the ruling class, and that's his whole argument here. But continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, right. I find it so interesting because I know communism is all about coming together and sharing the resources, but what I just blew my mind is we talk about communism as no money, right? But it's like, well, there can't be no money. No, like Karl Marx literally meant no money. You own your craft, right? And he almost advocates to where, if you think about it, it can't really work on large scale population. It sort of has to be smaller villages, which is why when he puts down, if you're again, I watched a video about how if you're a bread maker, you're just good at making bread. You own the craft, you make the bread, then you give the bread away. Then if you need something, you go get it. But that's why there's no passing down to generation. You don't give wealth to your sons and daughters because all you did was make bread and give it to people, or all you did was, fix the trolley or whatever. And it's almost like people these days, and I know we'll get into this in chapter 2 a little bit too, but it's just crazy how he literally meant no money, and because of that, population would stay lower and people would probably honestly die quicker, and that was fine by him.
Well, does he really think that the only way to do this is with a lower population? Because I feel like he doesn't actually think that. He thinks that the government should be in control of everything, and it should be, it's much bigger than that.
Only if the
Well-
government does what he wants, though.
Right.
It's he says the state. It doesn't necessarily it does mean nationalized, definitely in a sense, but
It's
it can
definitely
also mean a
globalized.
small. Well, it can also be interpreted to being a small community that is a state. Like it does
But
not
later,
mean. Yeah,
later
right.
he
It's
speaks
kind of
out
conflicting.
against that, though.
No, I do understand, but it is kind of, there are different interpretations from communists as to what this means, because some communists do believe that this interprets into you're going to end up subdividing into smaller groups. But he does talk about one huge thing in the second chapter as well. Before we go to the second chapter, though, what do you guys think about the fact that he says, as machinery becomes more improved, this is summarized here, women are able to join the workforce, which is a good thing for the bourgeois because now they just have more laborers who can produce more for them. I was like, yo, this whole woman movement is just like a ploy by the bourgeoisie just to get more people to work for them. You're just becoming a slave. Why do you want to be a woman in power? You're stupid. You're just becoming a part of the system. I don't
Yeah.
know. That was what came in my head.
No, well, no, and think about like just like spreading that from there, right? So like women started working. So then there were two incomes in many, many, many households, probably more than there aren't at this point, or at least we're getting there. But when that started happening, all of a sudden the price of housing and rent went up considerably. So now people are just in more debt. And now the women have to keep working if they want to have a place to live. So, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of things that I've agreed with that were problems from what I would consider the drunken ramblings of a madman. It's kind of like a diary.
Well, before we move on to chapter 2, yeah, that's true. Before we move on to chapter 2, one thing I do want to just get out is that, I mean, this, what he's talking about here is not the same thing that like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and all these other people bring up. Like they talk about how, oh, the wage workers at Amazon need to have stake in their labor, right? You know, she's talking about this type of capitalistic thing where they have some, I guess, equity within the company. That is not what Karl Marx is saying. Karl Marx is saying that if you are the packager at Amazon, there is no Amazon. You just are the packager. You own the packaging. Like that is your money, essentially. That is your wealth and well-being. And when you die, somebody just picks it up after you. There's no hand down, right? There's no accumulation of wealth at all. And so people conflate different things, but like what people talk about now, like in America, where workers' union own part of their craft, that is not even remotely as radical as what this guy talks about, which was crazy. And then the last thing was, it's just interesting. He basically says if you're a slave, you're better off than being a proletariat. And we can get into that later if you want, but he basically makes that point.
Well, which depending on how
Yeah.
you define slavery, that actually might be true. Like,
Like I said,
if you're talking servitude. But one last thing I wanted to hit on chapter 1 was, so he said the modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than the population and wealth. And so part of his whole theory here is that capitalism ultimately leads to that, right? But like, and that's what people say now because they keep screaming about the middle class is shrinking, okay? And the middle class is shrinking. But I pulled up a Pew Research graph, chart, whatever, that they published in the Seattle Times. And while the middle class has shrunk, the upper class has grown more than the lower class. So more people are becoming more wealthy than are not.
then more
Like,
poor.
yeah.
Yeah.
So now granted, that's also by, that standard, but I just find that that's the same standard we've been using, for 50, 60 years. But I just find that interesting. Like that part of the theory seemingly is not happening in
Yeah.
our
I
society.
mean, well, I mean, I give him a little bit of credit because he's, living in 1848 and doesn't know the things we know now. But even then, you should have been able to tell that, people 100 years ago were not living as as much of a wealthy life as they are now.
But it is interesting that he basically wrote this in response to the industrial age. And now we're kind of in that revolution ish thing right now because of the Silicon Valley age.
I give him a little bit of credit, I guess, because I feel like during that revolutionary time, there were probably a lot of workers being super taken advantage of in a lot of different ways.
Right. Are we ready to move on to chapter 2 here?
Yes.
All right. So this is real brief here. So chapter 2 is an argument as to whether communism is good or not. And the title of this chapter is Proletarians and Communists. So many of the arguments we are likely to discuss come from this chapter here. And at the very end of the chapter, it lists 10 rules of the Communist Party. And I just want to go through them really quick, and then we can go into detail on any particular one. But here are the 10 rules he lays out there. Abolish private property. He talks about a progressive tax, abolition of the right to inheritance, confiscation of property from immigrants and rebels, centralization of banks and national debt and credit, centralized communication and transportation, improvements to production paid for by the state, equal liability to all labor, combining agricultural and manufacturing equipment, and I guess industrialization, and then free education, as well as abolishing child labor. So, yep, in this chapter, he just goes into a little what the actual Communist Party think or do. So, what did we think about that?
So
It's the last one that I disagree with the most. You know, abolishing child labor. No.
Get those kids
Gotta
back
bring
in the
that back.
sweatshops.
So, at the very beginning, he says, in this sense, the theory of communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And I said, in a single word, no,
Dude.
which is actually a single word. Well, hold on, let me real quick. So he builds on that right after that, because I think this is kind of what we're going to talk about, at least a little bit at the beginning anyway. He says, you are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. And all I could think about when I read that was Bernie Sanders at every single debate screaming, the top 1%. That's all I could think of the whole time.
Yeah, this whole 9/10 of the population is total crap. Maybe it was the case then, I guess, but
it is interesting to me how, again, we're talking about basically no money, all goods for sale, all owning the property, but yet he talks about a really progressive tax on people. And I think, what do you guys, is it more like he wants to do the tax at first so then he can redistribute the wealth? So the tax and the confiscation of property for the quote unquote nation, the nation that is just of people, because he says no more countries, all global state, right? So it seems to me like some of these rules are rules that would eventually go away, right? So heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Well, you don't need that once the income is abolished, right? Abolition of rights to inheritance, same thing. And then confiscation of property. And I'll give the guy credit again, as Rob has been saying. I give him credit. He owns it. He's like, hey, are we going to take the property from the capitalist, the rich man? Yes, 100%. We're taking it. And basically, you just got to like it, bro.
Well, he says go ahead.
Well, what did y'all think about when he talks about like individuality vanishes because like I'm just really confused at what he's even trying to accomplish with this argument. Like individuality is gone because why?
Yes, comrade.
What I took from the argument was that he's saying it sounds like you losing your property would be non-beneficial to you. But in reality, he's saying your life becomes better when you give it to the greater good. Like you actually get more out of your property when you have it where everyone is using it equal. In a certain way. So you lose your individuality in that sense. Like your life's actually gotten better. That is his argument.
It's the same idea that people have about billionaires now, right? Rather than hoarding billions of dollars, they should just give it away or spread it out. And that would make their life more fulfilling rather than just like looking at a number in a bank be so big. You know?
It's not even about fulfillment, though. It's like he's saying it would actually be more productive as a whole.
Yeah, well, so here's what he says right after that. He says, "You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeoisie, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible." So now we went from the people who control everything to the middle class, and now the middle class has to go. Like it, I don't know. This is just like alcoholic Karl Marx. I don't understand. It's crazy.
Well,
That might have been the craziest thing I read.
I feel like the only people who are actually this diehard communists are the ones who know that they're going to be in power, in control of it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that sentence was just the words of a man who never had a job. Like
he does. It is sort of contradictory as well. There is things in this that sort of contradict itself. Like he talks about having no nation, but it is a nation. And then again, he talks about how there's no class, but he also says that like the state is the ruling class and that they're going to be the one making the decisions. But who are these people, right? So there's still deciders.
Yeah, and he says there's only two classes, but then here he's talking about the middle class and the bourgeoisie. He also and then he also later he starts talking about the petty bourgeoisie and the main ones. Like I don't know.
He really breaks it out.
That was in the third chapter, right? That he breaks it out.
I think I think it's the
slight
third chapter.
Detail as to what's going on there, but as far as wiping out of the middle class, so what he is saying is that the middle class is a part of the bourgeoisie. He is stating that here, and so they're the ones who own the property, as well as I guess you'd assume the upper class. But he is saying that this should be eliminated, but what he's saying is not. He's saying by eliminating the middle class and allowing the entire state to become an owner of this, the middle class is actually becoming elevated. Like his argument isn't just saying like, oh, let's just get rid of the middle class in that respect. It's more like saying we need to get rid of the things that make them the middle class.
So coming back to the contradictory part of this, he talks about the middle class, right? But how can the middle class also have all this property if only 10% of people have all of the property? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But yeah, I mean, he is more or less saying that the point is that everyone should be on the same level playing field. But the only way that he can describe it is to say that the lowest people would go to the top, because that would eventually even it out, right? And what's crazy is there are things that are true in it. So if Jeff Bezos decided that he was going to start using his money to help people more, right? Like his own personal money, that would be to the greater good of the nation. It would. That much money that he has, if he just out of the goodness of his heart was like, all right, hey, I'm going to fund certain colleges so people can go for free, right? You know what I mean? If people were to do that, if they were, I'm not saying they should or they have to. I'm just saying if they did that, it's possible that that would be for the collective good, right? But in order to get to that point, you have to do all the other stuff that he's talking about, which is to literally take from people and to essentially eliminate autonomy.
Yeah. Well, what about when he just like I don't know if he did this because like he was just like, okay, I'm just gonna slam my point home by just totally pivoting. He's like, do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. Like, whoa, what did that have to do with taking everybody's property away? Like, it's just like a hardcore pivot. And then go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was saying he's doing that like holier than thou thing. Like,
Yeah. Like
if
he's
one of
just
my
like
points is good, then they're all good.
exactly. But like the thing that starts getting me is when he talks about like he like pretends that poor people don't have families. Like he like almost explicitly says that. Like only rich people have families.
Well, because they can afford to keep their kids alive.
That is one of the overarching questions that I did want to ask at the end, because he talks about that in chapter 1. He kind of goes into detail as to why he thinks that in chapter 1. But what do you guys think about the fact that we actually, as the United States, do quite a few of these things here? Like we have a progressive tax. We do have free education. We abolish child labor. We have nationalized debt. Like we're like halfway communist. Like we've done half of the principles here.
After
Is
every
that a little
like
strange, or
I do think
Were
he's
those
right
his
about
good
one
philosophies?
thing. I do think he's right about one thing, that I think he's sort of saying in here that eventually every society is going to get to the point where communism kind of rises and takes over. And I think that is more or less true from what we've seen from history. And then
He was
your
right.
society restarts pretty much after the fall of communism.
Great reset. Yeah.
Unless you're like the Communist Party of China or Republic of China, whatever you want to call it.
I mean, to go over what Pianoman was just talking about, I think because the child labor thing, I think there's moral implications to that, right? So it's not necessarily that we were adopting it because of communism, but there are some moral things that he talks about that I think people can just get down with, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I just think as history goes, some people do pick and choose, right? There might be a king from a long time ago that was a crappy king, but he had like one good law that was good. So people are like, oh, we're going to keep that, right? So, and at the beginning, he says Europe has accepted communism as a power, communism as itself. So it was something that, even though this hadn't been written yet, it was something that was being accepted by people. And then therefore parts of it got adopted by the capitalists.
Isn't one of the first things he says is that every political power that is against another political power starts calling them communists? Like that's their name calling is, oh, these other guys are communists.
Yeah, like they wanted to lump them together.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he's like, no, we're the good ones though. We're the good communists. What did you guys think,
McCarthy?
I'll basically just try and sum this up because it was a giant excerpt. But like, what did you guys think about when he was like, the bourgeois just they're not content with being able to dominate everyone else and take their wives and their daughters as prostitutes, but he said specifically that the bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus at the most what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. Like he's saying that the ruling class is just out here banging each other's wives anyway, but they want to keep it to themselves. They don't want everybody else doing it.
And they want the prostitutes on the side.
Yeah, like
the proletariats.
that was a heck of a like I read that like
Accusation, yeah.
4 different times. I was like,
Yeah, that was
this
wild.
is this heavy.
Yeah. Well, and it almost like when I first read it, I was like, okay, so he's been talking about women and the role of women, but now he's basically turning women in. You're either a wife or you're a prostitute, and that's about it when it comes to what we're talking about. And it
Yeah.
makes it into this really simplistic
Yeah.
argument.
And he's like, you're gonna be either way.
yeah,
Yeah.
Like, no
Well,
matter
he's
which
like,
way this goes.
just
Yeah,
a baby maker or a prostitute.
he did say like if communism wins, you will just become a shared wife with everyone. He actually kind of says that, does he not? He's saying in
Yeah,
a
no,
communistic
yeah.
system, we're just
Yeah.
going to share wives.
He says
He
an
makes that
openly
argument.
legalized community of women.
Yeah.
Like, just take your pick, have at it.
Rob, what are your thoughts on legal prostitution?
And
Ah.
wife swaps.
I feel like legal prostitution is different than this actually. 'Cause
Yeah,
in
actually,
a communistic system, you wouldn't pay for it.
You just get
Yeah.
it.
You just go get
Considering
what
my
you want.
wife is probably going to listen to this, I probably shouldn't answer that question.
Let's go. My last question to the group before we move to chapter 3 is what do you guys think about the fact that he basically says that religion only exists because of the capitalist?
It doesn't
was
make
an atheist.
sense. That doesn't
an
make
atheist.
sense because, like, I don't know. I feel like before full blown capitalism, like, there was already religion.
Yep.
It seems like this guy's a failed Jew. He hasn't made any money, and now he wants all the handouts.
He just keeps getting exiled and kicked out of everywhere he lives, and he
Just
had
like
like
Bernie Sanders.
That's also true. That is true. Bernie did get kicked out of a commune.
Now to be fair to Marx here, I think throughout history, if you say that there's always been these two classes, right? The ruling class has always been the one who's kind of dictated the religion, though. So that
True.
does go to his argument here.
Yeah, I guess that's true because in England at the time, the Church of England was still the dominating force of the government. Same with like the Vatican in Rome and other places. So
Well, and that's part of the reason that in Europe, specifically, like the amount of atheists is significantly higher because you used to have the Church of England and all these things where the government was tied up directly with religion and ruled kind of hand in hand, right? Like going back to when the Pope crowned Charlemagne and made him emperor of the Western Roman Empire again. Like that was a thing. And then because they were in power, more people were worshiping that, with whatever religion it was, through Rome, through Greece, through whatever. So that's true. And then when they did get kind of overthrown and tackled across Europe in the 1700s, it did kind of shift in a different way. That's definitely true.
That
and
is
then in
Marx's whole
our
point.
Constitution, we did separation of church and state to separate from the Church of England. So yeah, man, you're right. We basically are just communists that make money.
Well, that's just
We're
a
like
capitalist.
we're halfway there,
We're-
as Piano Man said, is what I'm saying. We've adopted all the things.
Well, China has proven that you're able to be communist and capitalist at the same time.
If you're a bourgeois.